For the last few videos on my channel where we've been talking about the antinatalists and Emendum in particular, we've ended up talking about a familiar topic for my channel from probably a couple of years ago now, the topic of objective versus subjective morality. I found it interesting that a couple of people had commented in the comment sections, "What? I didn't know you were you believed in objective morality, unsubbed," or "I can't believe I was, subbed to you all this long without realizing, I spit up, I don't know, water on my computer screen or something." And what I find interesting about that is they don't even know what I mean probably by that. Because if they weren't around during the point in time when we were discussing that on my channel, then they wouldn't really know. And if they were, I think they would have phrased it differently. Not this again, or something like that. And this is one of those topics where we can definitely end up talking past each other unless we carefully understand what someone means, what their definition is of, for instance, with the free will discussion, where I've redefined it for myself to be rational will. I think it's a better descriptor for what I mean when I say that. And I still think that there's some issues there to be dealt with regards to reason and rational will. And the same thing with objective morality, because I think often people, and I've seen this again stated in some comments, have this idea that I'm referring to, a set of dictates written down somewhere by a lawgiver, a moral lawgiver. And of course, that would actually not be objective morality anyway. That would be completely subjective. It would be subject to the whim of that lawgiver. And that's not what I mean at all. What I mean when I talk about objective morality is something akin to identifying the relationship between sentient human beings and how those interactions impact one another, much in the same way that we recognize the relationship between objects and we develop maths around identifying the impact of different arrangements and different relationships between objects. And obviously it's far more nuanced when we're talking about the relationship of human beings, but that I think these things are objectively verifiable. And I've had a lot of people on my channel still saying there's no such thing as objective morality, it's all subjective. And to me, the biggest issue with this, of course, is a pragmatic issue. There are going to need to be a certain set of presuppositions anyone is going to be able to, you're going to need to bring to the table in support of their claims for whatever. And because if you don't do that, you're going to head down the infinite regress and eventually end up in the sort of semi-solipsistic, semi-nightmarish realm of how can you prove anything, and we don't know anything for sure, and I don't even know that you're here and all that. That doesn't get us anywhere. That's not practical at all. So I'm willing to grant people presuppositions. And of course, I'm going to want to be granted my presuppositions as well when we're trying to involve ourselves in any of these philosophical discussions. What I find interesting, though, is often when people tell me that there's only such a thing as subjective morality, that there's no true objective standards anywhere, they seem to be insinuating at the very least that they're not relying on any standard to make that claim, that that's just the claim that they're making. And again, the issue for me is a practical one. How can we best describe the nature of our reality and what things should be done? And so it's always a pragmatic issue. And so I'll ask them the question, if that's the case, if everything is subjective, how is it that you invoke laws? How is it that you dictate to other people what their behavior ought to be? And the answer is always something like, this one goes back a couple of years now, democratically, subjectively, respectfully. May not be in that order, but basically that was what was said. And I've had that said to me recently as well, that, well, I agree with a lot of the people in my sort of general region about some big heavyweight issues. There are some laws I don't agree with, but in general, I'm willing to go along, etc., etc. And the point that I made, and I've made in previous videos, is you are elevating one principle above others then when it comes to behavior and morality. And in this case, the principle you're raising above all others is consensus and mob rule. And that is fucking dangerous. And it's a terrible principle anyway, because you'll never be able to remain consistent with that as your principle. I would say the proper principle for identifying moral behavior is objective, verifiable identification of harm done and then deriving a set of prohibitions based on that. I think when it comes to objective morality, you can only end up with a few prohibitions. I don't think it can go much beyond that. In fact, I sort of agree, I agree that you can't get an ought from an is, but I would submit that you can get an ought not. I would submit you can get an ought not from an is. If you can identify objective, verifiable harm done, I think you would be hard-pressed to find some way to backtrack it and make the claim that causing that harm is the moral good. And, as part of my, I think, rationally justifiable set of presuppositions, I would submit to you that there are such things as aesthetics and moral heavyweight issues, and that they're not the same. Your preference for rock and roll music or something like that is an aesthetic choice. But there are certain issues that fall under the heading of moral heavyweight issues: murder, rape, theft, etc. When it comes to those moral heavyweight issues, they're never going to be amoral. They're either going to be the moral good or the moral evil. So I think you would be hard-pressed to make an argument that rape, for instance, as the easiest one generally speaking to use, is a moral good. And spare me the lifeboat scenarios. We've already discussed that on my channel before, where you say, well, what if someone came along and said, if you rape this person, we'll save the planet, but if you don't, we're going to kill everybody, including the person you would rape, etc., etc. And that's not a moral choice. That does not fall under the umbrella of moral choice. That is, at best, a comparative morality. Then you're comparing lesser of two evils. But morality is about being able to make a moral choice versus committing a moral evil. And so, again, I think you can identify objective harm. And I think when it comes to these heavyweight issues, I think we can make a good case for the fact that they are not morally neutral issues. Murder, the unjust killing of someone, the depriving of someone of their private property, in other words, enslaving them essentially. If a person has enacted labor to achieve something and then you take that achievement, you've effectively enslaved that person. Or rape. I think we can make the argument that those are not morally neutral issues. They're moral heavyweight issues. And enacting either of those things is either going to then be a moral good or a moral evil. And I think you'd be hard-pressed to make the case that those are moral goods, so we can use the objectivity of harm and suffering in order to determine these moral issues. And again, I think you can only really enact prohibitions based on those things. I don't think there is any such thing as a positive moral obligation. I don't think you have an unchosen positive moral obligation. I don't think you can be said that you have to do something that you haven't already committed to or chosen either by word or deed. Having children, well, you've just set yourself up for a whole bunch of positive moral obligations, but you chose that. You chose that by et cetera, et cetera. Now, what I think is interesting, again, is people who have elevated consensus and mob rule as their primary principle here over... out of a desire, I think, in a lot of ways, to not want to submit themselves to objective morality. And it's mostly secularists, obviously, who do that. And I still think it has something to do with them not wanting to succumb to anything even closely resemble a set of dictates from a moral lawgiver. And this is all rash. This is all completely secular. None of this has anything to do with a religion at all. This, again, is like maths. It is an identification of the relationship of peoples to one another and how they impact one another. And so it's not about a set of dictates. It's about a set of rational justifications for moral ought-nots. And again, the people who elevate mob rule and consensus as their principle, which is what they're doing, whether they admit it or not, they're setting themselves up for a world of hurt. And I don't think they would remain consistent with it. And I've made this case many times. If you're being honest with yourself, you would admit that the first thing you would do, if another group of people, by consensus and mob rule, took control of your regional law area and then enacted a bunch of laws that were restrictive to you, were imposing upon your personal individual freedoms and liberties and the right to be a homosexual or just any of these things, that you would be the first to say, that's immoral. And that would be hypocritical, of course, because you are you are agreeing to mob rule by elevating that as a principle. And so if you were going to be a consistent person, a rational person, then you would have to just go, well, it was great while it lasted. Democracy was fun while it lasted. And yeah, that's the funny thing is most of the people who are making this case, they don't even live in a democracy. They live in a republic where it has been deemed beforehand that it's not just to take away the rights of the minority simply because they are the minority. You can't have two wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner. And so there's a recognition that there is a moral principle above, in a way, mob rule and consensus, and that some things are not on the democratic table, right? And so that would hint towards there being some set of moral supremacy, more objectively morally supreme dictates there that people are agreeing on. Of course, most people will say, well, it's a Judeo-Christian nation founded on those principles, and then the arguments begin between those people. But what I found interesting, I was just going to bed last night, and in my suggested news feed came up one of the good old Gary Amendam's videos, and this one was right on the fucking money. And this is the one thing I appreciate about Gary in particular, is that he doesn't fall into this secular subjective morality BS, which, regardless in some ways of what can be proven, I think it's a lot easier to justify, to defend objective morality as a principle, the identification of objective harm and suffering. That's a lot more defensible than is consensus and mob rule. It doesn't take very long to break that argument down, especially if you talk about an influx of people who disagree with you and a change in the demographic, a change in the consensus. Suddenly things get a lot trickier there. But it is great to see someone like Gary who sticks to his principles, who identifies philosophy as a science of try to build a picture that's the most accurate representation of the actual nature of our existence and our relationship to one another as possible, to know that truth. Now, I'm not saying he gets the answer right. There are things that I disagree with him when it comes to the conclusion, but I think his desire to define it and his acceptance of some objectivity, I think his acceptance of being an objectivist is really refreshing. And so I want to play this clip for you where he really lays it out, and he lays it out well. In this clip, he was responding to, I think, a video by the Modern Mystic, I think is the guy's name, where they were talking about objective versus subjective morality. And the question being posed to Gary is, what's the problem with subjective morality if it gets us where we want to go? Like, if everybody sort of agrees in this country that murder and rape and theft are wrong, then what's the problem? Why do you need any more as an argument? And Gary lays it out. He lays it out very well. We need more because that doesn't tell us anything. It doesn't define, it doesn't describe anything objective. It's not transferable. It's not useful to us in other arenas, in other moral arenas. And I'll play this clip for you, and then I will comment afterwards.